There's nothing quite like the pain of losing something you love as a child. The memory stays with you forever, doesn't it? When Martha found that old photograph in her sister's attic, she saw herself at 7 years old, holding 2 baby owls she had rescued. She remembered how much she loved those little creatures. Then one day, they were gone. Her father said he took them back to the forest, but something never felt right about that story. Now, 57 years later, Martha is back in her childhood town. The neighbors still remember that summer. They remember the little girl with red hair who carried those owls everywhere. But they also remember things Martha was too young to understand back then. As Martha digs deeper into her family's past, she discovers the real reason her beloved owls disappeared. The truth is more heartbreaking than she ever imagined. What really happened to those 2 little owls that summer? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a soft grey shawl as Martha Henderson, now Martha Collins, after her brief marriage decades ago, drove her rental car down the winding gravel road toward home. Home. The word felt strange in her mouth after 37 years of absence. The house appeared through the fog, exactly as she remembered it, only smaller somehow, the way childhood places always shrink when you return as an adult. The 2-story farmhouse sagged under the weight of neglect, its white paint peeling like old skin, the wraparound porch listing slightly to one side. Wild roses had overtaken the picket fence, their thorny canes reaching across the walkway like grasping fingers. Ellen had lived here alone for the past 15 years, becoming more reclusive with each passing season, refusing Martha's offers to visit or help with repairs. Martha parked beside the old oak tree where she used to climb as a child, its massive trunk now bearing the scars of lightning strikes and decades of harsh mountain weather. She sat in the car for a long moment, gathering courage for what lay ahead. The funeral had been 3 days ago, sparsely attended, just herself, a handful of townspeople, and old Mrs. Henderson from next door, who shared her married name, but no blood relation. Ellen had died peacefully in her sleep, the doctor said. Heart failure, common enough at 72, but Martha knew her sister had died of something far more complex, a lifetime of carrying secrets that had slowly poisoned the well of their relationship. The screen door protested with a familiar screech as Martha stepped onto the porch. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through grimy windows. Inside, the house smelled of lavender sachets and old wood, the same scent that had surrounded their childhood like invisible arms. Ellen had kept everything exactly as their mother left it when she died 20 years ago. The same floral wallpaper, faded now to ghost-pale pink. The same braided rugs their mother had made during long winter evenings. Even the old coal stove stood in the corner, though Ellen had long since converted to electric heat. Martha climbed the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor, her hand trailing along the smooth-worn banister. Her childhood bedroom remained untouched. The single bed with its patchwork quilt, the small wooden desk where she'd done her homework by lamplight, the window that faced the woods where owls used to call in the darkness. It was in the attic, where she found it. Ellen had been an organized person, sorting her belongings into neat cardboard boxes labeled in her careful handwriting. Kitchen items, books, mother's things. But tucked beneath a stack of old quilts, Martha discovered a smaller box marked simply M, her initial. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay treasures she'd forgotten existed. Her old diary with its tiny brass lock, school papers, with gold stars, a pressed flower from her first-grade teacher. And there, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious, was the photograph. The image was faded to sepia tones, edges soft with age, but the memory it triggered was sharp as broken glass. There she stood at 7 years old, red braids catching, The summer sunlight, her thin arms cradling two small owlets against her chest. The baby birds looked impossibly tiny and vulnerable, their enormous dark eyes staring directly at the camera with that piercing gaze that only owls possess. Martha sank onto the dusty floor, the photograph shaking in her hands. She could almost hear their soft trilling calls, feel their downy feathers against her palms. Hoot and Whisper, she had named them. For 8 wonderful weeks they had been her constant companions, filling the lonely spaces of a childhood spent largely alone while her parents worked and her teenage sister lived in her own distant world. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. She had found them after a spring storm, their nest blown from a tall pine, their mother lying, broken on the forest floor. Her 7-year-old heart had broken for these helpless creatures, and she'd carried them home in her jacket, determined to save them. Her father had been surprisingly supportive at first, helping her create a makeshift nest in an old wooden crate, teaching her how to feed them bits of raw chicken with tweezers. Even her usually stern mother had smiled, watching Martha tend to her feathered charges with such devotion. Then one morning, they were simply gone. "I took them back to the woods where they belong," her father had explained gently but firmly. "They're wild creatures, Martha. They need to be free." She had cried for days, inconsolable in the way only children can be when their hearts are broken. But eventually, time had done what time does. The sharp edges of grief had worn smooth, becoming just another childhood sorrow filed away with scraped knees and hurt feelings. Now, holding this photograph 57 years later, Martha felt that old ache resurface with surprising intensity, but something else stirred too, a nagging sense that her father's explanation had never quite satisfied her, even as a child. "Martha, is that you up there?" The voice from below made her jump. She recognized it immediately. Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor who had been old even when Martha was young. "Coming, Mrs. Henderson," Martha called, carefully placing the photograph in her pocket before making her way downstairs. Beatrice Henderson stood in the doorway, a casserole dish in her arthritic hands, and concern written across her weathered features. At 89 she moved slowly but with dignity, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. "I saw your car and thought you might be hungry," Mrs. Henderson said, stepping into the kitchen without invitation. A privilege, earned through decades of neighborly friendship. "Ellen always said you'd come back someday." "Did she?" Martha accepted the dish gratefully, suddenly realizing she hadn't eaten since yesterday. "I wasn't sure she wanted me to." Mrs. Henderson settled herself at the familiar kitchen table, her sharp blue eyes studying Martha with the frank assessment of advanced age. "Ellen was proud of you, dear. Talked about your teaching career, how you helped all those children learn to read. She kept every newspaper clipping about your retirement ceremony." This news surprised Martha. She and Ellen had spoken perhaps once a year in recent decades, stilted conversations that revealed little beyond weather reports and health updates. The distance between them had grown so gradually that neither had seemed to notice until it became an ocean too wide to cross. "I found some old things in the attic," Martha said carefully, unsure why she felt compelled to mention the discovery. "Pictures from when we were children." Something flickered across Mrs. Henderson's face, so quickly Martha almost missed it. The older woman's hands stilled on her coffee cup, and for just a moment she looked away toward the window. "This old house holds a lot of memories," Mrs. Henderson said finally. "Some sweet, some not so sweet. Do you remember that summer when I had the baby owls?" Martha pulled the photograph from her pocket, placing it gently on the table between them. Mrs. Henderson studied the image for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, her eyes held a sadness that seemed to come from a deep, well-worn place. "I remember," she said quietly. "You loved those little creatures, something fierce. Used to carry them around in a basket, talking to them like they were your own babies. What happened to them, Mrs. Henderson? Really happened? I mean?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of borrowed songs. the sound filtering through the window, along with the scent of wild honeysuckle. "Some stories are complicated, dear," Mrs. Henderson said finally, "especially the ones from that particular summer. There were things happening then that you were too young to understand." "What kind of things?" Mrs. Henderson rose from her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 89 years. "The kind of things adults try to protect children from. Daddy was a good man, Martha. He did what he thought was best." After Mrs. Henderson left, Martha wandered through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that seemed to whisper of secrets. The old grandfather clock still chimed on the hour, its brass pendulum marking time the way it had throughout her childhood. Her mother's china still filled the hutch, each piece arranged exactly as it had been decades ago. In Ellen's bedroom, Martha found more evidence of her sister's hidden affection, a scrapbook filled with Martha's school photographs, report cards, even a program from her college graduation that Martha was surprised Ellen had kept. Why had her sister maintained this careful distance while secretly treasuring these connections? The house grew quiet as evening approached, settling into itself with the soft creaks and sighs of old wood. Martha made herself a simple dinner from Mrs. Henderson's casserole and sat at the kitchen table, the photograph propped against the salt shaker like a shrine to childhood innocence. Outside, darkness fell across the mountains with the swift finality of a theater curtain. And then, drifting through the open window, came a sound that stopped Martha's breath, the haunting call of an owl in the distant woods. She stepped onto the back porch, listening to that achingly familiar sound. How many nights had she stood in this exact spot as a child, hoping to hear hoot and whisper, calling back to her from whatever corner of the forest her father had chosen for their release. The owl called again, and Martha felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of old knots, a stirring of questions she had been too young to ask and too busy as an adult to remember. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin looking for answers. She owed that much to the 7-year-old girl in the photograph, the one who had loved so completely and grieved so deeply. She owed it to Ellen, whose secrets had shaped both their lives in ways Martha was only beginning to understand. The owl called once more before silence reclaimed the mountain night, and Martha went inside to begin the long work of sorting through a lifetime of carefully buried truth. The next morning dawned clear and bright, mountain air crisp with the promise of autumn. Martha woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. After a simple breakfast of coffee and toast, she drove into town, past the old general store and the white-steepled church, toward the veterinarian's office on Main Street. The building looked different than she remembered, updated with modern siding and a fresh coat of paint, but the same wooden sign hung by the door. Morrison Veterinary Services. Dr. Morrison had been ancient when Martha was a child. Surely he was long gone by now. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and a young man in a white coat looked up from behind the counter. He had the same kind eyes and gentle manner she remembered from the original Dr. Morrison, though his hair was dark where his predecessors had been silver. "Can I help you?" he asked, setting down a clipboard of patient files. "I'm Martha Collins. I used to be Martha Henderson. I lived up on Ridge Road when I was a child." His face brightened with recognition. "Of course. Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter. I'm Tom Morrison. Dr. Morrison was my grandfather. I'm so sorry for your loss. Ellen was a good woman. Thank you. Actually, I was hoping you might have some old records from back when your grandfather was practicing. From the summer of 1966, specifically." Tom's expression grew curious. "That's going back quite a ways. Grandpa was meticulous about his records, although kept everything in those old leather-bound journals. What are you looking for?" Martha pulled out the photograph, her fingers careful with its fragile edges. "I had 2 baby owls that summer. My father brought them here for treatment a few times. I was wondering if there might be any record of what happened to them." Tom studied the photograph with professional interest. "Owls, you said? That would have been unusual. Most people didn't know proper care for wild birds back then." He paused, thinking. You know, I might have something. Grandpa's journals are in the back room. He passed 5 years ago, but I kept everything. Felt wrong to throw away a lifetime of helping animals. Martha's heart quickened as Tom disappeared into the back office. She could hear him moving boxes, the rustle of old paper, the soft thud of books being stacked and restacked. "Here we go," he called. Summer of 1966. He emerged carrying a thick leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Grandpa wrote in these every day, recorded every animal he treated. What the problem was, what he prescribed. He opened the journal carefully, pages crackling as he turned them. Let's see, June 1966. His finger traced down the handwritten entries, and Martha found herself holding her breath. "Here," Tom said suddenly, "June 15th. James Henderson brought in 2 juvenile great horned owls, approximately 6 weeks old. Mother found dead, likely from collision with vehicle. Birds undernourished but responsive. Provided feeding instructions and antibiotics for minor respiratory infection." Martha leaned closer, studying her father's name in the careful script. "What else does it say?" Tom continued reading. June 22nd. Henderson owls showing good progress. Strong appetite, beginning to show hunting behaviors. Advised father that birds will need proper rehabilitation before release. July 1st. Concerned about Henderson's situation, father reports unusual men asking questions about family. Owls may be complicating an already difficult circumstance. "What does that mean?" Martha asked, though something cold was already forming in her stomach. Tom looked up from the journal, his expression troubled. "I'm not sure, but there's more." He turned the page. July 8th. James Henderson extremely agitated. During visit. Reports family receiving threats. Believes keeping wild birds illegally may provide ammunition for enemies. Difficult decision ahead. Martha felt the room tilt slightly. Enemies? What enemies? July 12th, Tom continued, his voice dropping. The Henderson situation has become untenable. James returned this morning deeply distressed. Says family safety depends on removing any violation of wildlife laws from their property. Discussed options. None of them good. The words hit Martha like physical blows. Her father hadn't simply decided the owls needed to be free. He had been. Forced to give them up to protect his family. But from what? From whom? Is there any more? She whispered. Tom turned several more pages, scanning quickly. July 20th. Resolved Henderson matter as best possible under circumstances. Contacted Sarah Mitchell at Mountain Wildlife Sanctuary. She agreed to take birds despite irregular situation. Transportation arranged for tonight. Pray this ends the family's troubles. Martha stared at the journal entry, her mind reeling. A wildlife sanctuary? Her father had told her he'd simply returned them to the woods, but he had actually arranged for professional care. Why lie about something so positive? Tom, she said carefully, what was happening in town that summer? These threats your grandfather mentioned, do you have any idea what they were about? Tom closed the journal, his expression thoughtful. I was just a kid in 1966, but I remember some tension in town. There was something about the logging company that operated up in the national forest. Some kind of investigation. He shrugged. Small-town politics, probably, but Grandpa's notes suggest it was serious enough to put your family in danger. Martha thanked Tom and left the veterinary office with her mind churning. The photograph in her pocket felt different now, not just a sweet memory, but evidence of something darker. Her father had lied to protect her, but from what terrible truth? Driving back through town, she noticed details that had escaped her. The day before. The old sawmill at the edge of town stood empty now, its windows broken, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. But in 1966, it would have been the economic heart of the community, providing jobs for most of the men in the area. She pulled into the parking lot and sat staring at the abandoned building. Somewhere in her memory, she could almost grasp something. Men. In suits, talking to her father in hushed, urgent voices, her mother crying in the kitchen after they left. The way her father would stand at the window in the evenings, watching the road as if expecting unwelcome visitors. The owls had been caught, in the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than a child's wildlife rescue. But what? That evening, Martha spread the photograph, the old diary she'd found, and a notebook on the kitchen table. She began writing down everything she remembered from that summer, searching for patterns she'd been too young to recognize. Her father working longer hours, her mother's increasing anxiety, Ellen becoming even more withdrawn than usual, spending most of her time in her room with the door locked, and underlying it all, the constant presence of fear, something she'd sensed without understanding. The owls had been her refuge from that fear. The one pure and simple joy in what she now realized had been a summer of terror for her family. No wonder her father had looked so torn when he explained their absence. He had been forced to sacrifice his daughter's happiness for her safety, but who had forced that choice, and why? Outside, an owl called in the darkness, the same haunting sound that had drawn her to the porch the night before. Martha stepped outside to listen, and as she stood in the cool mountain air, she made a decision. She would find out what really happened that summer. She owed it to the memory of her father, who had carried such a terrible burden alone. She owed it to Ellen, whose lifetime of distance suddenly seemed less like rejection and more like protection. And she owed it to Hoot and Whisper, whose innocent presence had somehow become entangled in adult corruption and fear. The owl called again, and this time Martha heard it not as a lament for childhood's end, but as a summons to finally understand the truth that had shaped her entire family's life. Tomorrow, she would begin digging deeper. The answers were here, buried in this small mountain town where everyone knew everyone's business, and secrets had a way of eventually finding their way to the surface. She just had to be brave enough to uncover them. Martha spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house settle around her. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to whisper secrets. Every sigh of the wind through the eaves carried hints of long-buried truth. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, she rose with gritty eyes and a determination that surprised her. With its intensity, she returned to the attic after breakfast, this time searching more systematically through Ellen's carefully organized boxes. In a container marked childhood items, she found treasures she'd forgotten existed. Her first-grade reader, a valentine she'd made for their mother, and tucked beneath a faded baby blanket, a small pink diary with a tiny brass lock. The key was long lost, but the lock was child-sized and flimsy. A gentle twist with a hairpin, and it popped open with a soft click that seemed to echo through the dusty space. The pages were filled with her 7-year-old handwriting, careful letters, formed with the concentration of a child just learning to shape words into thoughts. Martha sat cross-legged on the attic floor, reading entries that transported her back to that pivotal summer with startling clarity. June 14th, 1966. Found baby owls today. Mama Owl is dead. Daddy says we can try to help them. Named them Hoot and Whisper because Hoot makes more noise and Whisper is quiet like me. June 18th. Fed owls with tweezers like Dr. Morrison showed me. They eat so much. Daddy seems worried about something. Mama cried at dinner. Ellen won't talk to me. June 23rd. Hoot tried to fly today but fell down. Whisper watched from the cage like he was learning. The bad men came to the house again. Daddy told me to take the owls to my room and stay there until they left. Martha's breath caught. The bad men. Even at 7, she had sensed the wrongness of those visits, the way the house felt different after they left, charged with anger and fear, like the air before a thunderstorm. July 2nd. Daddy is working extra shifts at the mill. Mama says we need the money, but I think he doesn't want to be home when the bad men come. Ellen stays in her room all the time now. Only the owls make me happy. July 5th. Heard Daddy on the phone last night. He was angry, said something about won't. Let them destroy the mountain for profit. Don't know what he meant. The owls are getting bigger. Whisper caught a mouse today all by himself. July 10th. The bad men came back. This time, they were loud. One of them pointed at me when I was playing with Hoot and Whisper in the yard. Daddy looked scared, really scared. Mama made me come inside fast. Adult Martha felt her heart clench, reading her child self's innocent observations. She had been too young to understand that her family was under siege, that her beloved pets had somehow become pawns in a dangerous game she couldn't comprehend. July 15th. Something is wrong. Mama and Daddy whisper all the time now. Ellen won't even look at me. I asked if we were in trouble, but nobody answers. The owls are the only ones who still love me. July 18th. Dr. Morrison came to the house today instead of us going to see him. He looked at Hoot and Whisper for a long time, then talked to Daddy outside where I couldn't hear. After he left, Daddy sat on the porch for hours, just staring at the woods. July the 20th. The owls are gone. Daddy says he took them back to the forest where they belong, but something feels wrong about that. He won't look at me when he talks about it. Mama hugged me extra long at bedtime. Ellen's door was closed, but I heard her crying. The final entry was smeared, as if young Martha's tears had fallen on the page before the ink dried. Adult Martha's eyes filled, reading it, feeling across the decades her 7-year-old self's heartbreak and confusion. She closed the diary carefully, holding it against her chest like she might hold a wounded bird. The innocent words painted a picture of a family under terrible pressure, making impossible choices to protect each other. But from what? Who were these bad men who had terrorized her parents into sacrificing their daughter's happiness? Footsteps on the porch below interrupted her thoughts. Martha looked out the attic window to see Mrs. Henderson approaching with a covered basket, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had made this journey many times before. "Mrs. Henderson," Martha called softly as she descended the stairs. "You don't need to keep feeding me." "Nonsense," the older woman replied, settling the basket on the kitchen counter. "Ellen would haunt me if I let her sister go hungry." She paused, studying Martha's face with those sharp blue eyes. "You look like you've been digging through old memories." Martha held up the diary. "I found this in the attic, Mrs. Henderson. I need to know what really happened that summer. My diary mentions men who frightened my parents. Who were they?" Mrs. Henderson's expression grew guarded. She moved to the window, looking out toward the mountains, as if the answer might be written in their ancient slopes. "Your father was a good man," she said finally. "One of the most honest men I ever knew. That's what got him into trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes when you stand up to people with more money and power than conscience." Mrs. Henderson turned back to Martha, her face etched with old pain. "There was a logging company operating in the National Forest that summer. Cascade Timber, they called themselves. On paper, they had all the right permits, all the proper documentation." Martha waited, sensing there was more. "But your father worked in the mill. He saw the lumber coming in, knew the forest better than anyone. He started noticing things, trees cut from protected areas, ancient groves that should never have been touched, species habitat destroyed that was supposed to be preserved by law. He was a whistleblower," Martha said, understanding dawning. "He tried to be. Contacted the Forest Service, the environmental protection agencies, but Cascade Timber had friends in high places, and your father was just one man against a company worth millions." Mrs. Henderson's hands clenched into fists. "They didn't appreciate his interference, so they threatened him, threatened the whole family. Made it clear that James Henderson would lose his job, face legal troubles, maybe worse, if he didn't back down and keep quiet." Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They were thorough in their threats, Martha. Mentioned every member of your family by name, including you." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that made Martha's stomach turn. Her innocent wildlife rescue had become a weapon in the hands of ruthless men, a technical violation they could use to destroy her father if he continued to oppose them. "The owls," Martha said quietly. Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Keeping wild birds without proper permits was illegal. Most folks looked the other way when children tried to help injured animals, but if someone wanted to make trouble, she trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. They would have used it against Daddy. Heavy fines, possible jail time, definitely the loss of his job, and your family couldn't afford any of that. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table to touch Martha's hand. Your father loved those owls almost as much as you did, because they made you so happy. Giving them up nearly broke his heart. Martha stared down at the diary, seeing her father's impossible choice with adult eyes. Let his daughter keep the creatures she loved or protect his family from men who would use that love as a weapon. What happened to the company? She asked. Eventually, the truth came out. Too many people asking questions, too much evidence to ignore. But it took years, and by then the damage was done. Miles of old-growth forest destroyed, wildlife habitats ruined. Mrs. Henderson's voice hardened. The executives paid some fines and moved on to destroy someone else's mountains. None of them ever faced real consequences. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees with a sound like whispered secrets finally being spoken aloud. Martha understood now why Ellen had remained distant, why her parents had seemed to carry such heavy burdens in the years that followed. The corruption they had witnessed, the powerlessness they had felt, the terrible choice they had been forced to make. It had left scars on the entire family. But it had also revealed the depth of their love, the lengths they would go to protect each other. Her father had sacrificed his principles to keep his family safe, and even in their darkest hour, he had found a way to ensure the owls would be properly cared for. The truth was more complex than her child's mind could have grasped, but it was also more beautiful than she had ever imagined. That afternoon, Martha found herself drawn to Ellen's bedroom, a space she had barely entered even as a child. Ellen had always been intensely private, keeping her door closed and her thoughts locked away behind a wall of teenage reserve that had somehow never come down, even into adulthood. Now, sorting through her sister's belongings felt like an archaeological dig through layers of carefully maintained distance. Ellen's room was sparse, almost monastic in its simplicity. A single bed with a plain blue coverlet, a wooden dresser worn smooth by decades of use, a bookshelf lined with classics and bird identification guides. It was the books that caught Martha's attention first. Field guides to Appalachian wildlife, volumes on conservation, biographies of environmental activists. Ellen had developed interests that their childhood had never revealed, passions she had pursued in solitude. Behind the books, Martha discovered something unexpected, a high school yearbook from 1968, 2 years after that pivotal summer. But it wasn't the typical collection of smiling senior photos and activity lists. Ellen had hollowed out pages in the center, creating a secret compartment filled with newspaper clippings. Martha spread the yellowed articles across Ellen's bed, studying them in chronological order. The earliest dated from July 1966, just days after her diary's final entry about the disappearing owls. Forest Service investigates logging violations, read one headline. The article was brief, reporting that federal agents were looking into allegations that Cascade Timber had exceeded their permitted harvest areas in the Cherokee National Forest. Another clipping dated August 1966. Local mill worker provides evidence in federal investigation. This article mentioned her father by name, identifying him as a key witness who had documented illegal logging operations with photographs and detailed records. Martha's hands trembled as she read. Her father had ultimately found the courage to come forward, despite the threats to his family, but the timing told a story. He had only been able to act after the owls were safely removed from his home, eliminating the weapon his enemies could use against him. A September article revealed more. Cascade Timber executives indicted on federal charges. The piece detailed a pattern of environmental destruction spanning multiple states, with the company systematically harvesting protected timber and falsifying documentation to cover their crimes. But it was the final clipping that made Martha's breath catch. Hidden beneath the others, folded small and brown with age, was a different kind of article entirely. This one was from the local paper's community section, dated August 15th, 1966. Local girls' wildlife rescue leads to environmental discovery, the headline read. The article was accompanied by a grainy photograph, the same image Martha now carried in her pocket, but printed in the newspaper for the entire town to see. The article told the story of 7-year-old Martha Henderson, who had rescued 2 orphaned owls, and in doing so, had inadvertently led to the discovery of illegal logging operations. It explained how her father's visits to the veterinarian had put him in contact with other concerned citizens, how the network of people who cared about wildlife had gradually assembled the evidence needed to expose Cascade Timber's crimes. Young Martha's dedication to these injured birds, the article concluded, serves as a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can have far-reaching consequences. The owls she rescued have now been successfully relocated to a professional wildlife sanctuary, where they will be prepared for eventual release into a protected habitat. Martha sank onto Ellen's bed, the newspaper clipping shaking in her hands. She had been more than just an innocent child caught in adult corruption. She had been the catalyst that brought the truth to light. Her love for 2 orphaned owls had provided her father with the connections and credibility he needed to expose environmental crimes. But why had no one ever told her? Why had her family let her believe for decades that the owl's disappearance was simply another childhood disappointment rather than part of something heroic and important? She found part of the answer in Ellen's dresser drawer, tucked beneath carefully folded sweaters. A manila folder contained more newspaper clippings, but these were different, darker in tone, filled with threats and intimidation that had continued long after Cascade Timber's legal troubles began. "Witness family harassed," read one headline from October 1966. The article described anonymous phone calls, vandalism of property, and economic pressure applied to families who had cooperated with federal investigators. Another clipping detailed the suspicious fire that had damaged the Henderson family's barn in November 1966, though no charges were ever filed. Martha remembered that fire, remembered her father's grim face as he surveyed the damage, her mother's fearful glances toward the woods as if expecting more trouble to emerge from the shadows. The final piece of the puzzle was a handwritten note, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. Martha recognized Ellen's teenage handwriting, though the words were more mature than she remembered her sister being capable of at 16. "Martha doesn't understand yet why people are angry at our family," the note read. "She thinks Daddy gave away her owls because he didn't care about her feelings. I can't tell her the truth, that he saved her owls and saved us all by being brave enough to stand up to bad people. Someday when she's older, maybe she'll understand. But for now, I have to let her think he was just being mean. It's better than her knowing how scared we all were. I hate watching her cry about those stupid birds. But I hate more thinking about what those men might have done to our family if Daddy hadn't found a way to make them leave us alone. Ellen Henderson, age 16. Martha pressed the note to her chest, finally understanding the terrible burden her teenage sister had carried. Ellen had known the truth all along, had watched Martha grieve and rage against their father's decision while being unable to explain the nobility behind it. For 57 years, Ellen had protected Martha from the knowledge that their childhood had been shadowed by real danger, that their father had been a hero rather than a heartbreaker. Ellen had sacrificed her relationship with Martha to preserve her innocence, just as their father had sacrificed the owls to preserve their safety. The pattern was becoming clear now. A family that loved so deeply they were willing to let themselves be misunderstood rather than burden each other with painful truths. Ellen's lifetime of distance hadn't been rejection or indifference. It had been protection, carried out with the same fierce devotion their father had shown when he gave up the owls. Outside Ellen's bedroom window, the late afternoon sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Martha gathered the newspaper clippings carefully, understanding now why Ellen had preserved them so meticulously. They weren't just historical artifacts. They were evidence of a family's courage, proof that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win, even when the cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. She thought about her own daughter, Sarah, living 3 states away with her own family, their relationship strained by years of misunderstanding and unspoken resentments. How many families, Martha wondered, were divided not by lack of love, but by too much of it, by the well-meaning secrets people kept to protect each other from pain. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Martha felt her heart skip a beat. They hadn't spoken since the funeral, and that conversation had been brief and dutiful. "Hi, Mom." Sarah's voice was cautious, the way it had been for years. "I was just calling to see how you're doing, with the house and everything." "I'm managing," Martha said, then stopped herself. The old pattern of careful, surface-level conversation felt suddenly inadequate after the revelations of the past 2 days. "Actually, Sarah, I'm learning things about our family that I never knew, about why your Aunt Ellen and I were never close." There was a pause. "What kind of things?" Martha looked down at the newspaper clippings spread across Ellen's bed. Evidence of sacrifices and secrets that had shaped generations, the kind that might help explain why families sometimes struggle to understand each other, even when they love each other very much. "Mom, are you okay? You sound different." "I think I'm starting to understand some things I should have figured out a long time ago," Martha said softly, "about love and protection, and the prices people pay to keep their families safe." Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer. "Do you want to talk about it?" For the first time in years, Martha found herself wanting to have that conversation, really have it, without the careful politeness that had characterized their relationship for so long. But first, she needed to finish uncovering the truth about that summer, needed to understand fully what her father and Ellen had sacrificed and why. "Soon," she promised. "I think I'm finally ready to tell you some stories about your grandfather that you've never heard, about the kind of man he really was, and why that mattered more than I understood when I was younger." After they hung up, Martha sat in Ellen's room as darkness settled over the mountains. The newspaper clippings told a story of environmental crime and family courage, but they raised as many questions as they answered. What had happened to the wildlife sanctuary that had taken Hoot and Whisper? Had the owls survived their relocation? And why had her father chosen never to tell her the truth about his heroism, even years later when the danger had passed? Tomorrow, she decided she would try to trace the path her beloved owls had taken when they left her father's hands. She would follow their story to its conclusion, and in doing so, maybe she would finally understand the full measure of her family's love and sacrifice. The owls had been more than pets. They had been the thread that connected a little girl's compassion to a father's courage, the catalyst that turned family love into something larger and more powerful than any of them had imagined. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and Martha felt the sound not as an echo of loss, but as a promise. The truth was still out there, waiting to be discovered, and she finally had the courage to seek it out. Martha spent a restless night haunted by dreams of men in dark suits and owls calling from cages they could never escape. She woke before dawn with a determination that felt almost physical in its intensity. Today, she would find out what the authorities had really known about her family's situation and how much help they had provided when it mattered most. The county sheriff's office occupied a modern brick building on the outskirts of town, a stark contrast to the weathered storefronts and century-old houses that lined Main Street. Martha parked in the visitor's lot and took a deep breath before walking through the glass doors. The young deputy at the front desk looked up with professional courtesy. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I'd like to request some old police records if possible. From 1966. My name is Martha Collins. I was Martha Henderson then. My family was involved in a federal investigation that year. The deputy's expression grew more attentive. What kind of records are you looking for? Reports of threats made against my family. My father was a witness in an environmental crimes case, and I believe he contacted local law enforcement for help. Records that old would be in our archives. Let me check with Sheriff Patterson. He might want to speak with you personally. 20 minutes later, Martha found herself sitting across from Sheriff Jim Patterson, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with human nature at its worst and best. Henderson, he said thoughtfully, pulling out a thin manila folder. I remember this case, though I was just a deputy then. Your father was a brave man, Mrs. Collins. Not many people would have stood up to Cascade Timber the way he did. What kind of threats did he report? Sheriff Patterson opened the folder, scanning the typewritten reports inside. Phone calls mostly at first. Anonymous callers saying he should mind his own business, worry about his family's safety instead of trees. Then it escalated. Martha leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. July 10th, 1966, the sheriff read. James Henderson reported 2 men in a black sedan parked outside his property for several hours. When he approached them, they made specific threats against his daughter, mentioning that little girls who played with wild animals might find themselves in dangerous situations. The blood drained from Martha's face. They had threatened her directly, used her innocent love of the owls as ammunition against her father. July 15th, Sheriff Patterson continued. Henderson reported his mailbox was vandalized, filled with dead birds. July 18th, someone slashed his truck tires and left a note warning him to think about his family's future. What did you do? Martha asked, though something in the sheriff's expression already suggested she wouldn't like the answer. What we could, he said carefully. We increased patrols in your neighborhood, took statements, documented everything, but Cascade Timber had lawyers, political connections. The men making the threats were careful never to do anything we could prove in court. So you couldn't protect us. Sheriff Patterson closed the folder, his expression grim. Your father was fighting a company worth millions of dollars, Mrs. Collins. They had resources we couldn't match, influence we couldn't counter. All we could do was promise to respond quickly if anything happened and hope the federal investigation would move fast enough to end the harassment. Martha felt a familiar childhood emotion, the sense that the adult world was vast and dangerous, filled with threats too complex for simple solutions. Her father had been essentially alone, facing down powerful enemies with nothing but his conscience and the hope that speaking truth would be enough. There's something else, Sheriff Patterson said quietly. He pulled out another report, this one handwritten rather than typed. This is from Sheriff Morrison, my predecessor. It's marked confidential and was never filed officially. What does it say? That your father came to him in late July, desperate for advice. Cascade Timber had made it clear they knew about the owls you were keeping illegally. They were threatening to report your family to wildlife authorities. Press for maximum penalties unless your father withdrew his cooperation with the federal investigation. The room seemed to spin slightly. Martha gripped the arms of her chair, understanding now the impossible position her father had been placed in. Sheriff Morrison advised him to remove the birds immediately before Cascade could use them as leverage. But your father was worried about what that would do to you emotionally. He'd watched you bond with those owls, seen how they helped you, cope with the family's stress, so he arranged for them to go to a sanctuary, Martha whispered. Morrison put him in touch with a wildlife rehabilitator who operated quietly, off the books, someone who would take the birds and relocate them safely, far enough away that Cascade couldn't use their presence against your family. Sheriff Patterson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Your father solved 2 problems at once, kept you safe from men who had specifically threatened you, and ensured the owls got proper care. But he never told you the truth because he didn't want you to know how much danger the family was really in. Martha stared down at her hands, seeing her father's dilemma with painful clarity. Tell his 7-year-old daughter that bad men wanted to hurt her because she loved 2 orphaned birds, or let her think he had simply decided the pets had to go. Either way, her heart would be broken, but one choice would preserve her innocence. "The federal case," she asked. "What happened after the owls were gone?" "Your father's testimony was crucial. The photographs he'd taken, the documentation he'd kept. It helped convict 3 Cascade executives and shut down their entire operation. But the harassment continued for months afterward. Your family paid a high price for doing the right thing. Why didn't anyone ever tell me this? Even later, when I was grown up?" Sheriff Patterson smiled sadly. "From what I remember of your father, he was the kind of man who didn't need credit for being brave. He did what needed doing and moved on. Some folks are like that. They protect their families and don't expect medals for it." Martha left the sheriff's office with a heavy heart, but also with a strange sense of pride. Her father had been more than just a good man caught in bad circumstances. He had been a hero, willing to sacrifice everything for both environmental justice and family safety. But the more she learned about his courage, the more she understood the weight he must have carried. To stand up to corruption while protecting a vulnerable child, to make impossible choices while maintaining hope for the future, it was more than any person should have to bear alone. As she drove back toward the house, Martha found herself thinking, not just about her father's heroism, but about the cost of that heroism. How many nights had he lain awake, worrying about his family's safety? How many times had he second-guessed his decision to speak out, wondering if his conscience was worth the price his loved ones might have to pay? The owls had been symbols of innocence in a world suddenly revealed to be dangerous and complex. Her father's love had been strong enough to preserve both the birds and that innocence, even when it meant accepting years of guilt and misunderstanding. Now, finally, Martha was ready to honor that sacrifice by seeking out the rest of the truth. Back at the house, Martha found herself drawn to her mother's old sewing room, a small space off the kitchen that had always smelled of lavender and cotton starch. The room remained exactly as her mother had left it when she died. The ancient Singer sewing machine still threaded with blue thread, pattern pieces for a dress that would never be finished, spread across the cutting table. Martha had avoided this room for years, even during brief visits home. Her mother's presence lingered too strongly here, in the neat rows of buttons sorted by color, the pincushion shaped like a tomato, the wooden spool holder that her father had made as a wedding gift decades ago. Now, searching for answers about her family's past, Martha felt compelled to look through her mother's personal belongings. In the bottom drawer of the sewing cabinet, beneath yards of carefully folded fabric, she found a small wooden box she didn't remember seeing before. Inside were letters, some in her father's careful handwriting, others in her mother's flowing script. Love letters from their courtship, notes passed between them during their marriage, brief messages left on kitchen counters about mundane domestic matters. Martha felt like an intruder reading these intimate communications, but something compelled her to continue. Near the bottom of the box, she found something that made her breath catch. A letter in her mother's handwriting, but addressed to someone. Named Ruth, dated July 22nd, 1966. The envelope had never been sealed, the letter apparently never sent. "Dear Ruth," it began. "I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to mail this, but I need to write it down, or I think I'll go crazy with worry." Martha sank into her mother's sewing chair, unfolding the letter carefully. "James is determined to do the right thing about those terrible men and what they're doing to the forest. I'm proud of him. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. But I'm also more frightened than I've ever been. They threatened Martha specifically, Ruth, a 7-year-old child. What kind of people threaten a little girl? The worst part is the owls." My sweet baby loves those little creatures more than anything in the world. They've become her whole universe since all this started. I think caring for them is how she's coping with the tension in the house, though she doesn't understand what's wrong. But keeping wild birds is illegal, and those awful men know it. They're using Martha's innocent love against us, threatening to have James arrested for wildlife violations if he doesn't stop cooperating with the federal investigators. The fines alone would bankrupt us, and if James went to jail, Martha had to pause, wiping away tears that had started flowing without her notice. I watch Martha with those owls every day, and my heart breaks knowing what we're going to have to do. She feeds them so carefully, talks to them like they're her babies, falls asleep next to their cage so she can hear them breathing. Taking them away will destroy her, but keeping them might destroy all of us. James found someone who will take them, a wildlife woman who rehabilitates birds and releases them back to nature. She promised they'll be cared for properly, that they'll have a chance at real freedom instead of staying in our makeshift cage forever. I know it's the right thing to do, but how do I explain that to a 7-year-old? How do I make her understand that sometimes love means letting go? I've been crying for days, Ruth, not just for Martha, but for James too. He loves watching her with those owls. It's the only time he smiles anymore, seeing her so happy and gentle with them. Taking that away from her is breaking his heart as much as hers. Maybe someday when she's older we can tell her the truth, that her daddy gave up her owls to keep her safe, that loving her mattered more than anything else in the world. But for now, we have to let her think we just don't understand how much they meant to her. I pray she'll forgive us someday. I pray she'll understand that everything we did was because we loved her too much to let anything happen to her. Your friend always, Dorothy. Martha clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by the depth of her mother's anguish. All these years, she had carried a child's resentment about the owl's disappearance, never imagining the agony her parents had endured in making that decision. Her mother had seen everything, understood that the owls were Martha's emotional anchor during a terrifying time, recognized that taking them away would cause profound hurt, but accepted that sacrifice because the alternative was so much worse. Martha thought about her own daughter, Sarah, about the protective choices she had made over the years that Sarah had resented or misunderstood. How many parents, she wondered, carried the weight of decisions their children couldn't appreciate until they became parents themselves? She folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box, but not before reading it twice more. Her mother's words painted a picture of a family bound together by love so fierce it made terrible choices bearable, so deep it found ways to preserve hope even in the darkest circumstances. The sewing room felt different now, not like a shrine to loss, but like a testament to endurance. Her mother had sat in this chair, surrounded by the tools of creation and care, and had found the strength to sacrifice her daughter's happiness for her daughter's safety. Outside, the late afternoon light was fading into evening. Martha made herself a simple dinner and sat at the kitchen table with the letter, her diary, and the newspaper clippings Ellen had saved. The pieces of that long-ago summer were finally forming a complete picture, but it wasn't the story of betrayal and abandonment she had carried in her heart for decades. Instead, it was a story of extraordinary love. Love that found creative solutions to impossible problems. Love that chose protection over understanding. Love that carried secrets to spare others pain. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the screen again, and this time Martha answered with genuine warmth instead of careful politeness. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "Mom, you still sound different. Are you sure you're okay?" Martha looked down at her mother's letter, thinking about the cycles of protection and sacrifice that connected generations of families. "I'm learning some things about my parents that I never knew, about the kinds of choices people make when they love someone more than themselves. What kind of choices? the kind that don't make sense until you understand how much danger someone was willing to face to keep their family safe. Martha paused. Sarah, I think I owe you an apology for some things I did when you were younger. Decisions that probably seemed unfair or controlling, but were really about being afraid something might happen to you. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer than Martha had heard. In years. Maybe we could talk about that when you get home. I'd like that very much, Martha said, understanding for the first time that healing sometimes began with admitting how much you didn't know about the people you loved most. After they hung up, Martha sat in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of 3 generations of family secrets and sacrifices. Tomorrow she would continue searching for the truth about what happened to Hoot and Whisper. Tonight she would sit with the knowledge that love was more complicated and more powerful than she had ever imagined. Martha woke the next morning with a sense of purpose that carried her through breakfast and into Ellen's bedroom, where she had decided to make one final, thorough search. There had to be more, some clue about what had happened after the owls left their home, some trace of the wildlife rehabilitator who had taken them. She had been through Ellen's dresser and closet, but the bedside table had remained unexplored. The single drawer stuck slightly, warped by decades of mountain humidity, but finally yielded to Martha's persistent tugging. Inside, beneath a worn Bible and a few prescription bottles, Martha's fingers encountered something unexpected. A small tape recorder, the kind that had been popular in the 1980s. Next to it lay a single cassette tape with Ellen's careful handwriting on the label, "For Martha." Martha's hands trembled as she inserted the tape and pressed play. After a moment of static, Ellen's voice filled the room. Not the Ellen of recent years, weakened by age and illness, but a stronger version from perhaps 20 years ago. "Martha," Ellen's recorded voice began, "if you're listening to this, it means I'm gone and you've finally come home. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you this story for decades, but somehow it never seemed like the right time." Martha sank onto Ellen's bed, clutching the small recorder. "You were so angry with Daddy after the owls disappeared. Do you remember? You barely spoke to him for weeks, and when you did, it was with that cold politeness that breaks a parent's heart. He never said anything, but I could see how much it hurt him. He would sit on the porch in the evenings, staring toward the woods where he told you he'd taken them, and sometimes I would see him crying." Martha closed her eyes, remembering her 7-year-old fury, the way she had punished her father with silence and distance. "The truth is, Martha, Daddy never took those owls anywhere. He was planning to. He had contacted Dr. Morrison about finding a wildlife sanctuary, and everything was arranged. But the night before they were supposed to be transferred, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how heartbroken you were going to be, how you would hate Daddy for the rest of your life, for taking away the only things that made you happy during that terrible summer." Ellen's voice caught slightly, and Martha could hear her take a shaky breath before continuing. "So I did something I've regretted and been proud of in equal measure for my entire life. I snuck out of the house at midnight and took Hoot and Whisper myself." Martha's eyes flew open, staring at the tape recorder in disbelief. "I knew about the wildlife rehabilitator Daddy had found. Sarah Mitchell, her name was, and she lived about 50 miles east in the next county. I had her address from a conversation I overheard between Daddy and Dr. Morrison. I put the owls in their traveling cage, loaded everything into my car. Yes, I was driving illegally at 16. But those were different times, and I made the trip in the middle of the night." Martha could hardly breathe. All these years, she had imagined her father driving through the forest with her beloved owls, choosing some random clearing to abandon them. Instead, it had been Ellen, protective, secretive Ellen, who had orchestrated their rescue. Sarah Mitchell was extraordinary, Martha. Even at that hour, she welcomed us without question. She had built proper aviaries, had all the equipment needed for rehabilitation. She examined Hoot and Whisper thoroughly, said they were healthy, and showed good signs of being ready for eventual release. She promised they would be cared for until they could survive on their own. Ellen's voice grew stronger, more confident. But here's the part I never told anyone, not even Daddy. Sarah had been following the Cascade Timber case in the newspapers. She knew who our family was, knew what Daddy was risking by standing up to them. When I explained about the threats, about how the owls were being used as leverage against our family, she made me a promise. Martha leaned closer to the recorder, desperate to hear every word. She said she would not only care for the owls, but she would document their progress with photographs and notes. She would track them after release, monitor their success in the wild. She said if they survived and thrived, it would be proof that what Daddy was doing, protecting both wildlife and his family, was worth the sacrifice. The recording paused, and Martha could hear Ellen moving around, perhaps pouring herself a glass of water. I drove home before dawn and went to bed, letting Daddy discover the empty cage in the morning. I watched him struggle to explain their disappearance without admitting he had planned to give them away. I watched you blame him for something he hadn't even done, and I said nothing. Martha felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the complexity of her family's love and sacrifice. For months afterward, I received letters from Sarah Mitchell, photographs of Hoot and Whisper growing stronger, learning to hunt, preparing for release. When they were finally set free in a protected forest preserve, she sent me a picture of them, perched together on a branch, looking exactly like the wild creatures they were meant to be. Ellen's voice grew softer, more reflective. I kept those letters and photographs for years, Martha. I told myself I would show them to you someday, when you were old enough to understand. But as time passed, it became harder and harder to admit what I had done. How do you tell your sister that you let your father take the blame for your own actions? How do you explain that you were protecting her innocence while destroying her relationship with the man who loved her most? The truth hit Martha like a physical blow. Ellen hadn't been distant out of indifference or resentment. She had been carrying the weight of this secret, living with the knowledge that her attempt to protect Martha had inadvertently damaged Martha's relationship with their father. I thought about telling you after Daddy died, but by then so much time had passed. You had built a life away from here, and it seemed cruel to burden you with the truth when it couldn't change anything. But now, knowing that I might not have much time left, I realized that secrets don't protect people, they isolate them. Ellen's voice was becoming strained, emotional. The owls lived, Martha. They were released successfully and monitored for years. Sarah Mitchell's last letter, which I received in 1975, reported that both birds had mated and were raising young of their own. Your love saved them, and in a way, it saved all of us. Daddy's testimony helped convict the men who were destroying the mountains, and the threat to our family eventually ended. Martha sobbed openly now, understanding the terrible irony of it all. Ellen had tried to preserve Martha's relationship with their father by taking responsibility for the owl's disappearance. But in keeping that secret, she had allowed Martha to blame their father for decades. I know I hurt you by being so distant. All these years, Ellen continued, but I couldn't bear to be close to you while carrying this lie. Every time you mentioned Daddy, every time you talked about that summer with bitterness or anger, I wanted to tell you the truth but couldn't. Find the courage. The recording was almost finished, Ellen's voice now barely above a whisper. I hope someday you can forgive me, Martha, not just for taking the owls, but for letting you live with the wrong story for so long. Daddy loved you more than his own life. Everything he did that summer, standing up to those men, fighting for what was right, even planning to give up your owls, he did it to protect you. The owls are buried in the box with this tape, Martha. All of Sarah Mitchell's letters, all the photographs of Hoot and Whisper learning to be wild and free. They lived good lives because of your compassion, and they contributed to something bigger than any of us imagined. The tape ended with a soft click, leaving Martha alone in the silence of Ellen's bedroom, surrounded by the weight of revelation and the echo of a sister's long-carried guilt. She reached into the drawer with shaking hands, finding the promised box of letters and photographs. As she lifted the lid, she saw Hoot and Whisper as she had never imagined them, not as the helpless babies she remembered, but as magnificent wild owls, powerful and free, their eyes bright with the intelligence and independence they had been born to possess. Ellen had given them their freedom and then spent a lifetime regretting the price that freedom had cost their family. But now, finally, the truth could set them all free. Martha spent the rest of that day poring over Sarah Mitchell's letters and photographs, each one revealing new layers of hope and healing she had never known existed. The wildlife rehabilitator had been meticulous in her documentation, creating a detailed record of Hoot and Whisper's journey from traumatized orphans to independent wild creatures. The earliest photos showed them in professional rehabilitation cages, far superior to the makeshift arrangements Martha and her father had created. Sarah had provided proper perches at varying heights, natural branches for exercise, and specialized equipment for flight training. The owls looked alert and healthy, their eyes bright with the focused intelligence that made their species such successful predators. Later photographs documented their development, learning to hunt live prey, strengthening their flight muscles, gradually reducing their dependence on human care. Sarah's accompanying notes were filled with admiration for their resilience and adaptability. August 15th, 1966, one letter read, "Both owls are exceeding expectations for rehabilitation success. The female, Whisper, as your family named her, is particularly adept at hunting and has begun to demonstrate territorial behaviors that suggest strong wild instincts. The male, Hoot, is more social but equally capable. I expect them to be ready for release within 6 weeks." Martha traced the words with her finger, imagining Ellen as a 16-year-old reading these updates in secret, carrying the burden of hope and guilt in equal measure. The release photographs were the most moving of all. Taken in September 1966, they showed 2 magnificent great horned owls perched on branches at the edge of a vast forest preserve. They looked nothing like the helpless babies Martha remembered. These were powerful, wild creatures, their posture alert and confident, their feathers pristine in the dappled sunlight. September 20th, 1966. Release successful. Both birds showed immediate comfort with forest environment, no signs of dependency or confusion. They separated within hours, which is normal behavior for this species at this age. We'll continue monitoring through winter to ensure successful adaptation. The monitoring reports continued for nearly a decade, each one confirming what Martha had hardly dared to hope, that her beloved owls had not only survived, but thrived in their natural habitat. Spring 1968. Female spotted with mate and 2 fledglings in territory approximately 3 miles from release site. Excellent sign of successful rehabilitation and species contribution. Fall 1969. Male observed with different. Female suggesting successful territory establishment and breeding behavior. Both original birds appear to have integrated fully into local owl population. The final letter, dated 1975, brought Martha to tears. "I wanted to provide one last update on the remarkable owls your family helped save 9 years ago. Through ongoing monitoring and collaboration with the State Wildlife Department, we have documented at least 12 offspring from the 2 birds over the past several years. Their genetic contribution to the local great horned owl population has been significant, and their descendants continue to thrive in the protected forest area. Please know that your family's compassion and sacrifice contributed to something much larger than saving 2 individual birds. You helped preserve genetic diversity, supported population health, and demonstrated that human kindness can have ripple effects across generations of wildlife. The forest preserve where they were released remains protected land, ensuring that their descendants will have safe habitat for decades to come. Your love for two orphaned owlets has created a living legacy that will continue long after all of us are gone. Martha set the letter down carefully, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Not only had Hoot and Whisper survived, they had created their own families, contributed to the species' continuation, left behind a living testament to the power of compassion and proper care. But more than that, she was beginning to understand the true scope of her family's sacrifice. Her father had been willing to give up her happiness to ensure the owls received proper care. Ellen had risked everything to make that care possible while preserving Martha's innocence. Her mother had carried the agony of watching her daughter's heart break while knowing it was necessary for her safety. Each of them had chosen love over understanding, protection over credit, sacrifice over acknowledgement. Now, armed with Sarah Mitchell's detailed records, Martha knew exactly where the owls had been released. The letters included maps and specific location information describing a forest preserve in the next county that had been established specifically to protect wildlife habitat. She called the current wildlife department to verify that the preserve still existed and was accessible to visitors. The ranger she spoke with was enthusiastic about her story and eager to help. "Ma'am, that area has been expanded significantly since the 1960s. He explained. It's now part of a larger conservation network, over 10,000 acres of protected forest. The great horned owl population there is one of the most stable in the region. Would it be possible to visit, to see the area where they were released?" "Absolutely. We offer guided tours for people with special connections to the preserve's history. Your story would be particularly meaningful. We don't often get to document the long-term success of individual rehabilitation efforts from that era." Martha made arrangements for the following day, then sat at Ellen's kitchen table to process everything she had learned. The photograph that had started this journey lay before her, but now it represented something entirely different than when she'd first found it. This wasn't a picture of loss and abandonment. It was documentation of love so profound it found ways to protect multiple lives simultaneously. Her 7-year-old self, cradling those baby owls, had been the catalyst for a chain of events that involved environmental heroism, family sacrifice, and conservation success spanning decades. She picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Hi, sweetheart," she said when her daughter answered. "I have a story to tell you about your grandfather, about the kind of man he really was, and why understanding that matters for our own relationship." "I'm listening, Mom." For the next hour, Martha shared everything: the threats, the impossible choices, Ellen's secret mission, and the miraculous outcome documented in Sarah Mitchell's letters. She explained how fear and love had shaped her family's decisions, how secrets intended to protect had created decades of misunderstanding. "Mom," Sarah said when Martha finished, "I had no idea Grandpa went through all that. No wonder you were so protective when I was growing up. I think I understand now why families sometimes struggle to communicate," Martha said softly. "We love each other so much that we try to shield each other from difficult truths, but sometimes those shields become walls." "Is that why you never talked about your childhood much? About what it was really like growing up there?" Martha looked around Ellen's kitchen, seeing it now not as a place of secrets and distance, but as the heart of a home where people had made impossible choices. "Out of love. I think I was carrying my own secrets, Sarah. My anger at my father, my resentment about the owls, my confusion about why Ellen always seemed so distant. I never understood that all of it came from love. Messy, complicated love that sometimes made decisions I couldn't appreciate until now." "What changed? What made you finally understand?" "Finding the truth," Martha said. learning that the story I'd been telling myself for 57 years was wrong. My father wasn't heartless. He was heroic. Ellen wasn't distant. She was protective. Even my mother, who I thought just didn't understand how much the owls meant to me, was carrying her own terrible burden of having to watch me suffer for my own safety. They talked for another hour, with Sarah sharing her own perspective on growing up with a mother who sometimes seemed overprotective, who worried too much about dangers that never materialized. Martha began to see how her own childhood trauma had shaped her parenting, how the fear passed down through generations, even when the original threat was long gone. "I want to show you something," Martha said finally. "Tomorrow, I'm going to visit the place where Hoot and Whisper were released, the preserve where they lived and raised their families. Would you like to come with me to see the end of the story?" "You mean they really survived? They had babies?" "Multiple generations of babies. The letters document their success for nearly a decade, and the ranger I spoke with says the owl population there is still thriving." There was a long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, I would love to come with you, but I'm 3 states away, and with work and the kids. What if I waited until next weekend? Could you arrange to fly down for a few days?" "You would wait? This seems so important to you right now." Martha looked at the photographs spread across the table, at Ellen's careful handwriting documenting decades of carried secrets, at the evidence of love and sacrifice that had shaped her entire family's story. "It is important," she said, "but sharing it with you is more important. Some discoveries are meant to be experienced together." After they hung up, Martha called Mrs. Henderson to share the news about Ellen's recording and Sarah Mitchell's letters. The older woman wept openly when Martha described the wildlife rehabilitator's detailed documentation of the owl's success. "Your sister carried that secret for so long," Mrs. Henderson said. "I always wondered why she seemed so sad when you visited, why she could never quite look at you directly. Now I understand. She was protecting you from her own guilt while living with the knowledge that your anger was misdirected. Do you think she was wrong to keep it secret?" Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "I think she was young and scared and trying to protect everyone at once. Sometimes love makes us do things that seem wrong from the outside, but make perfect sense when you understand the fear behind them." That evening, Martha walked through the house with new eyes, seeing evidence of her family's love in every carefully preserved room. Ellen had kept everything exactly as their parents left it, not out of inability to move forward, but as a shrine to the sacrifices they had made. The owl quilt on Martha's childhood bed took on new meaning. Her mother's way of keeping the memory of those beloved birds alive even after they had to disappear from Martha's life. The books about wildlife and conservation in Ellen's room revealed a sister who had spent her life trying to understand and honor the choice she had made at 16. Even the distance Ellen had maintained wasn't rejection. It was protection, a way of loving Martha without having to look directly at the pain her secret had caused. Outside, owls called in the darkness, as they had every night of Martha's childhood. But now their voices didn't sound mournful. They sounded like celebration, like the continuation of something beautiful that had begun with a 7-year-old girl's compassion and grown into something larger than any of them had imagined. Tomorrow, she would prepare for the journey to the preserve. Next week, she would share that journey with her daughter, creating new memories to balance the painful ones from the past. For the first time in decades, Martha felt complete, not because all the questions were answered, but because she finally understood the depth of love that had shaped every answer her family had given. The week that followed felt like suspended time, filled with anticipation and preparation. Martha spent her days organizing the documents and photographs she had discovered, creating a comprehensive record of her family's story to share with Sarah. She also made arrangements with the Forest Preserve, speaking several times with Ranger David Peterson, who had become increasingly excited about documenting the connection between the 1966 rehabilitation effort and the current owl population. "Mrs. Collins," he told her during their final planning call, "we've been tracking owl families in this preserve for decades. If your birds really did establish successful breeding populations here, there's a good chance some of their descendants are still active in the area. Great horned owls can live 15 to 20 years in the wild, and they're very territorial. Families often stay in the same general area for generations." The possibility that she might encounter actual descendants of Hoot and Whisper made Martha's heart race with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Sarah arrived on Friday evening, flying into the small regional airport with an overnight bag and the same determined expression Martha remembered from her childhood when she had set her mind on understanding something important. "Mom," Sarah said, embracing her at the baggage claim, "you look different, lighter somehow." Martha hugged her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and marveling at how much they both had to learn about each other. "I feel different," Martha admitted, "like I've been carrying something heavy for my whole life without realizing it, and now I can finally put it down." They spent Friday evening at the kitchen table, with Martha sharing every detail of her discoveries. The diary entries, Ellen's confession tape, Sarah Mitchell's letters, the evidence of environmental heroism and family sacrifice that had been hidden for decades. Sarah listened with the intense focus of someone trying to reconstruct her entire understanding of family history. "So great-grandfather was actually an environmental hero," she said finally, "and great-aunt Ellen saved the owls, but couldn't tell you because she was protecting everyone's feelings. And my mother wrote letters she never sent, documenting the agony of watching her daughter's heart break for her daughter's safety," Martha added. "It was love, Sarah. All of it was love, even when it looked like rejection or abandonment or cruelty. Is that why you were always so worried about me when I was growing up? Always asking where I was going, who I was with, when I'd be back?" Martha nodded. "I think I inherited their fear, without understanding its source. I knew something bad could happen to children, but I didn't know why I was so certain of it." They stayed up late talking, sharing perspectives on family dynamics that both had carried for years without fully examining. Sarah revealed her own frustrations with Martha's protective instincts, while Martha explained the anxiety that had driven those instincts without her conscious awareness. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for their planned visit to the preserve. They made the drive together, winding through mountain roads that grew increasingly wild and beautiful as they approached the conservation area. Ranger Peterson met them at the visitor center, a man in his 40s with the weathered complexion and easy manner of someone who had spent his career working outdoors. He carried a folder thick with maps, photographs, and documentation about the preserve's owl population. "Before we head into the field," he said, leading them to a conference room lined with wildlife photographs, "I want to show you something remarkable that we discovered this week." He opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Martha recognized some of them. Copies of Sarah Mitchell's letters and rehabilitation records that she had shared with the ranger to help plan their visit. "We've been comparing Ms. Mitchell's original release documentation with our current population surveys," Peterson explained. "Using GPS coordinates from her letters, we identified the exact area where your owls were released in 1966, and this is what we found." He pulled out a detailed map of the preserve, marked with colored pins and tracking information. The red pins mark confirmed great horned owl nesting sites over the past 5 years. The blue pins mark the original release site and the immediate surrounding territory. He paused, pointing to the densest cluster of red pins. "Look at the pattern." Martha studied the map, her pulse quickening as she began to see what he was showing them. "The highest concentration of current nesting activity is within a 2-mile radius of the original release site," Peterson continued. "Great horned owls are highly territorial and tend to establish breeding territories close to where they themselves were raised. The population genetics work we've done suggests that at least 60% of our current owls carry DNA markers consistent with birds. Introduced to this area in the 1960s. Sarah reached for Martha's hand. "Mom, that means your owls didn't just survive," Peterson said quietly. "They founded a dynasty. Their descendants have been the primary breeding population in this preserve for nearly 6 decades. Martha stared at the map, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was seeing. The 2 tiny orphans she had loved and lost had become the foundation of an entire ecosystem's success. "Are you ready to meet them?" Peterson asked gently. The trail into the preserve wound through towering oak and hickory trees, their canopy so dense that the forest floor remained cool even in the afternoon sunlight. Peterson led them deeper into the woods, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in this wild space. "Great horned owls are most active at dawn and dusk," he explained as they walked. "But this time of year, with young to feed, we sometimes spot them hunting during the day. The pair we're looking for has been nesting in this area for 3 years running." Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent 57 years believing that Hoot and Whisper had simply vanished into the wilderness, their fates unknown and unknowable. Now she was about to see their living legacy, the continuation of something she had thought was lost forever. The trail opened into a small clearing dominated by an enormous old-growth pine tree, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter, its branches reaching toward the canopy like ancient arms. Peterson stopped and raised his binoculars, scanning the upper branches with practiced eyes. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a thick branch about 40 feet up. "Do you see the nest?" Martha squinted upward, shading her eyes with her hand. At first she saw only branches and shadows, but gradually her eyes adjusted, and she began to make out a large, dark shape nestled in a fork of the massive trunk. "I see it," Sarah whispered beside her. Are there birds in it?" Peterson handed Martha his binoculars. "Look carefully. The female should be visible." Martha raised the binoculars with trembling hands, adjusting the focus until the nest snapped into sharp detail. And there, looking directly back at her with enormous, golden eyes, was a magnificent great horned owl. The breath left Martha's lungs in a rush. The owl was beautiful beyond anything she had imagined, easily twice the size of the babies she remembered, with perfectly groomed brown and white plumage and those distinctive feathered horns that gave the species its name. But it was the eyes that stopped her heart, the same piercing, intelligent gaze she remembered from Hoot and Whisper, ancient and knowing and utterly wild. "She's incredible," Martha breathed. "She's also a great-great-granddaughter of one of your original birds," Peterson said softly. "Based on our tracking and genetic work, this particular family line traces directly back to the 1966 release." Martha lowered the binoculars, tears streaming down her face. She handed them to Sarah, who raised them eagerly to study the magnificent creature above them. "Oh my God, Mom," Sarah whispered. "She's looking right at us. It's like she knows." They stood in reverent silence for several minutes, watching the owl watch them. Occasionally, she would turn her head with that distinctive owl motion, scanning the forest around them, but always her gaze returned to the 3 humans below. "There's more," Peterson said quietly. He led them to a different angle where they could see deeper into the nest. "She has young." Martha raised the binoculars again, and this time she saw them. 2 fluffy white owlets, still covered in down, their oversized eyes bright with curiosity as they peered over the edge of their nest. They looked exactly like Hoot and Whisper had looked that day she'd first found them, helpless and vulnerable, and utterly dependent on adult care. "The cycle continues," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "It does more than continue," Peterson replied. "It thrives. This preserve now supports one of the most stable great horned owl populations in the southeastern United States. 63 breeding pairs at last count, most of them descendants of birds released here in the 1960s and 70s. As if summoned by their conversation, a deep, resonant hoot echoed through the forest. The female in the nest above them responded. Immediately, her call rich and powerful, carrying through the trees like a song of belonging. "That's her mate," Peterson explained. "He's returning from a hunting expedition." They waited in hushed anticipation until a second owl appeared, landing on a branch near the nest with a small rodent in his talons. He was even larger than his mate, his plumage more varied in its brown and white patterns. He studied the humans below with the same intense gaze, but seemed unconcerned by their presence. Martha watched as he delivered his prey to the nest, observed the gentle way he interacted with his mate and offspring. These were wild creatures, living exactly as they were meant to live. Free, successful, contributing to the continuation of their species. "Your 7-year-old instinct to save those orphans," Peterson said quietly, "led to this. An entire ecosystem, sustained by the descendants of 2 birds you loved enough to risk everything for." Martha reached for Sarah's hand, needing to anchor herself to the present moment, while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Above them, both parent owls settled into the nest with their young, a family complete, and thriving in the wild home their ancestors had claimed nearly 6 decades ago. "Thank you," Martha whispered, not sure if she was speaking to the owls, to Ellen's memory, to her father's courage, or to Sarah Mitchell's dedicated care. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for growing. Thank you for proving that love and sacrifice and hope can create something beautiful that lasts." The owls hooted softly in response, their voices joining the evening chorus of the forest they had helped preserve and populate. For the first time in her life, Martha felt the story was complete. 3 months later, Martha stood in the renovated kitchen of her childhood home, watching through the window as her granddaughter Emma chased fireflies in the twilight. The house looked different now. Fresh paint, repaired shutters, a new roof that no longer leaked during mountain storms. But more than the physical changes, the house felt different. The weight of secrets had been lifted, replaced by the lighter burden of understood truth. Sarah had extended her visit to 2 weeks, helping. Martha sought through decades of family belongings, and more importantly, decades of family misunderstandings. Together, they had created a comprehensive record of their family's story. Photographs, letters, documents, and Ellen's confession tape, all carefully organized in a leather album they planned to pass down to Emma and her younger brother. "It's important for children to know where they come from," Sarah had said as they worked. "Not just the pretty parts, but the complicated parts too. The parts that show how love can be messy and imperfect and still be real." Martha had decided to keep the house, not as a retreat from her life in the city, but as a bridge between past and present, a place where family stories could be told and retold without the distance that had characterized previous generations. Mrs. Henderson visited every few days, often bringing Emma cookies or small gifts, delighting in the child's presence the way she had once delighted in Martha's. At 89, she moved more slowly than before, but her memory remained sharp, and she had become Emma's favorite source of stories about the old days. "Tell me again about Grandma Martha and the baby owls," Emma would request, and Mrs. Henderson would patiently recount the tale of a 7-year-old girl whose compassion had created something larger than anyone imagined. Martha had established the Ellen Henderson Memorial Wildlife Fund, using the proceeds from selling her city house to create an endowment that would support owl research and habitat preservation in perpetuity. The fund provided grants to wildlife rehabilitators, funded nest box programs, and supported genetic research that tracked owl populations across the region. Ranger Peterson had become a friend and frequent correspondent, sending regular updates about the preserve's owl population and their ongoing success. The breeding pair Martha and Sarah had observed that first day had successfully raised their 2 owlets, who were now establishing territories of their own within the preserve. Your family's legacy is literally flying all over these mountains, Peterson had told her during his most recent visit. We've documented owl dispersal patterns that show descendants of your original birds have colonized habitats across 3 counties. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Martha's relationship with Sarah. The secrets and distances that had characterized their family for generations had been replaced by a new commitment to honest, open communication. They spoke several, and times a week now, sharing not just surface pleasantries, but deeper thoughts and feelings about their lives and choices. Sarah had brought her own family to visit the preserve, introducing Emma and her brother to the owls that had shaped their family history. The children had been appropriately awed by the magnificent birds, and Emma had declared her intention to become an owl scientist when she grew up. Maybe you will, Martha had told her. Maybe you'll discover things about owls that we never knew, just like I discovered things about our family that I never understood. On this particular evening, as fireflies began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Martha heard the familiar sound that had drawn her outside every night since returning home, the call of great horned owls in the nearby forest. But now, the sound carried different meaning. It wasn't a reminder of loss or childhood disappointment. It was a celebration of continuity, of love that had found ways to flourish despite obstacles and misunderstandings. Emma ran up to the porch, breathless and glowing with excitement. "Grandma Martha, I caught 3 fireflies. Can we go listen for the owls now?" This had become their evening ritual, sitting on the porch as darkness settled over the mountains, listening for owl calls and talking about the connections between past and present, between the small actions of individuals and the larger patterns of life and love. "Of course, sweetheart," Martha said, settling into the old porch swing with Emma beside her. They sat quietly for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the mountain evening, crickets and katydids, the rustle of wind in the oak leaves, and then, drifting from the forest like a blessing, the deep, resonant hoot of a great horned owl. "Is that one of our owls?" Emma asked, using the possessive pronoun that made Martha's heart swell with pride and joy. "It might be," Martha replied. "All the owls in these mountains are connected to each other, just like all the people in families are connected to each other, even when they don't understand how." Emma considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important concepts, like how great-great-granddad was connected to you even when you were mad at him. Exactly like that. Love doesn't disappear just because we don't understand. It finds ways to keep growing even when we're not paying attention, the owl called again, and another answered from a different part of the forest. Soon, a chorus of owl voices filled the evening air, a sound that might have represented the conversations of multiple generations, the ongoing dialogue between past and present that sustained both families and ecosystems. Martha reached for Emma's hand, thinking about the chain of connection that stretched from her 7-year-old self to this moment. Love expressed through rescue, sacrifice disguised as abandonment, secrets kept to protect innocence, truth revealed to heal understanding. "Grandma Martha," Emma said softly, "when I grow up, I want to help owls too." "I think you will, sweetheart," Martha replied. "I think you already are, just by listening to their stories and caring about what happens to them." Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the owl calls continued their ancient conversation. Martha felt the presence of everyone who had contributed to this moment. Her father's courage, her mother's sacrifice, Ellen's protection, Sarah Mitchell's expertise, and now her own choice to transform family secrets into family strength. The story that had begun with a 7-year-old girl's compassion for 2 orphaned owlets had become something larger and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. It would continue through Emma and her generation, carried forward by the same love that had sustained it through decades of misunderstanding and separation. Some stories, Martha realized, are too big to end. They just keep growing, like the families they nurture and the love they preserve.